Hi guys, I'm back. Been a long time. I know. I'm sorry. So I'm going to read chapter 2. Oops, book's upside down. Chapter 2 of Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing. In the first chapter, remember that Peter won a turtle at Jimmy Fargo's birthday party. And now I'm going to read chapter 2, Mr. and Mrs. Juicio. One night, my father came home from the office, all excited. He told us Mr. and Mrs. Yarby were coming to New York. He's the president of the Juicio Company. He lives in Chicago. I wondered if he'd bring my father another crate of Juicio. If he did, I'd probably be drinking it for the rest of my life. Just thinking about it was enough to make my stomach hurt. My father said he invited Mr. and Mrs. Yarby to stay with us. My mother wanted to know why they couldn't stay at a hotel, like most people who come to New York. My father said they could, but he didn't want to. He thought they'd be more comfortable staying with us. My mother said that was about the silliest thing she'd ever heard. But she fixed up Fudge's bedroom for our guests. She put fancy sheets and brand new blankets on the bed, on the hide-a-bed. That's a sofa that opens up into a bed at night. It's in Fudge's room because that used to be our den. Before he was born, we watched TV in there, and lots of times Grandma slept over on the hide-a-bed. Now we watch TV in the living room, and Grandma doesn't sleep over very often. So I want you to just stop and think about any connections or reminders that you've had as I've read the first part of the chapter. And as I read on, I want you to pay attention and listen for any funny parts that happen. Okay, so remember you're listening for funny parts. My mother moved Fudge's crib into my room. He's going to get a regular bed when he's 3, my mother says. There are a lot of reasons I don't like to sleep in the same room as Fudge. I found that out 2 months ago when my bedroom was being painted. I had to sleep in Fudge's room for 3 nights because the paint smell made me cough. For one thing, he talks in his sleep. And if a person didn't know any better, a person could get scared. Another thing is that slurping noise he makes. It's true that I like to hear it when I'm awake. But when I'm trying to fall asleep, I like things very quiet. When I complained about having to sleep with Fudge, my mother said, "It's just for 2 nights, Peter. I'll sleep in the living room," I suggested, "on the sofa or even a chair." "No," my mother said, "you will sleep in your bed, in your own bed." There was no point arguing. Mom wasn't going to change her mind. She spent the day in the kitchen. She really cooked up a storm. She used so many pots and pans, Fudge didn't have any left to bang together. And that's one of his favorite pastimes, banging pots and pans together. A person could get an awful headache listening to that racket. So racket means noise. Right after lunch, my mother opened up the dinner table. We don't have a separate dining room. When we have company for dinner, we eat in one end of the living room. When Mom finished setting the table, she put a silver bowl filled with flowers right in the middle. I said, "Hey, Mom, it looks like you're expecting the president or something." "Very funny, Peter," my mother answered. Sometimes my mother laughs like crazy at my jokes. Other times she pretends not to get them. And then there's the times when I know she gets them, but she doesn't seem to like them. I know she gets them, but This was one of those times. So I decided no more jokes until dinner. I went to Jimmy Fargo's for the afternoon. I came home around 4 o'clock. I found my mother standing over the dinner table, mumbling. Fudge was on the floor playing with my father's socks. I'm not sure why he likes to play so much with socks so much, but if you give him a few pairs, He'll play quietly for an hour. Hi, Mom, I'm home, I said. I'm missing 2 flowers, my mother said. I don't know how she noticed that 2 flowers were missing from her silver bowl, because there were at least a dozen of them. But sure enough, when I checked, I saw 2 stems with nothing on them. Don't look at me, Mom, I said. What would I do with 2 measly flowers? So we both looked at Fudge. Did you take Mommy's pretty flowers? My mother asked him. No, take, Fudge said. He was chewing on something. What's in your mouth? My mother asked. Fudge didn't answer. Show Mommy. No show, Fudge said. Oh, yes. My mother picked him up and forced his mouth open. She fished out a rose petal. What did you do with Mommy's flowers? She raised her voice. She was really getting upset. Fudge laughed. Tell Mommy. Yum, Fudge said. Yummy, yummy, yummy. Oh, no, my mother cried, rushed into the telephone. She called Dr. Cone. She told him that Fudge ate 2 flowers. Dr. Cone must have asked her what kind, because my mother said roses, I think, but I can't be sure. One might be a daisy. There was a long pause while my mother listened to whatever Dr. Cone had to say. Then Mom said, thank you, Dr. Cone, and she hung up. No more flowers, she told Fudge. Oops, sorry, I have to reread that because I was thinking that was Fudge talking. So remember, when we read, dialogue helps us. No more flowers, she told Fudge. You understand? No more, Fudge repeated. No more, no more, no more. My mother gave him a spoonful of peppermint-flavored medicine, the kind I take when I have stomach pains. Then she carried Fudge off to have his bath. Leave it to my brother to eat flowers. I wonder how they tasted. Maybe they're delicious and I don't know it because I've never tasted one. I thought. I decided to find out. I picked off one stem from a pink rose, put it in my mouth, and tried to chew it up, but I couldn't. It tasted awful. I spit it out in the garbage. Well, at least now I knew I wasn't missing anything great. So I want you to stop and think about anything funny that you think was funny so far that's happened. Fudge ate his supper in the kitchen before our company arrived. While he was eating, I heard my mother remind him, Fudgy's going to be a good boy tonight. Very good for Daddy's friends. Good, Fudge said. Good boy. That's right, my mother told him. I changed and scrubbed up while Fudge finished his supper. I was going to eat with the company. Being 9, let me reread that. I was going to eat with the company. Being 9 has its advantages. My mother was all dressed up by the time my father got home from the yard with the Yarbies. You'd never have guessed that my mother spent most of the day in the kitchen. You'd also never have guessed that Fudge ate 2 flowers. He was feeling fine. He even smelled nice, like baby powder. Mrs. Yarby picked him up right away. I knew she would. She looked like a grandmother. That type always makes a big deal about Fudge. She walked into the living room, cuddling him. Then she sat down on the sofa and bounced Fudge around on her lap. Isn't he the cutest little boy? Mrs. Yarby said. I just love babies. She gave him a big kiss on the top of his head. I kept waiting for somebody to tell her Fudge was no baby. But no one did. My father carried the Yarby suitcase into Fudge's room. When he came back, he introduced me to our company. This is our older son, Peter, he said to the Yarbys. I'm 9 and in 4th grade, I told him. How do you do, Peter? Mr. Yarby said. Mrs. Yarby just gave me a nod. She was still busy with Fudge. I have a surprise for this dear little boy, he said. It's in my suitcase. Should I get it? Yes! Fudge shouted. Go get! Go get! Mrs. Yarby laughed, as if that was the best joke she'd ever heard. I'll be right back, she told Fudge. She put him down and ran off to find her suitcase. She came back carrying a present tied up with a red ribbon. Ooh, Fudge cried, opening his eyes wide. Goody! He clapped his hands. Mrs. Yarby helped him unwrap his surprise. It was a wind-up train that made a lot of noise. Every time it bumped into something, it turned around and went the other way. Fudge liked it a lot. He likes anything that's noisy. And I said, that's a nice train. Mrs. Yarby turned to me. Oh, I have something for you too, Peter. Nope, sorry. Let me read back up. Remember when we read, if we doesn't sound right, we go back and start. Mrs. Yarby turned to me. Oh, I have something for you too. Peter, I reminded her. My name is Peter. Yes, well, I'll go get it. Mrs. Yarby left the room again. This time she came back with a flat package. It was wrapped up too, red ribbon and all. She handed it to me. Fudge stopped playing with his train long enough to come over and see what I got. I took off the paper carefully in case my mother wanted to save it, and also to show Mrs. Yarby that I'm a lot more careful with things than my brother. I'm not sure she noticed. My present turned out to be a big picture dictionary, the kind I liked when I was about 4 years old. My old one is in Fudge's bookcase now. I don't know much about big boys, Mrs. Yarby said, so the lady in the store said a nice book would be a good idea. A nice book would have been a good idea, I thought, but a picture dictionary, that's for babies. I've had my own regular dictionary since I was 8, but I knew I had to be polite, so I said, thank you very much. It's just what I've always wanted. I'm so glad, Mrs. Yarby said. She let out a long sigh and sat back on the sofa. My father offered the Yarbys a drink. Good idea. Good idea, Mr. Yarby said. What'll it be? My father asked. What'll it be? Mr. Yarby repeated, laughing. What do you think, Hatcher? It'll be Juicio. That's all we ever drink. Good for your health. Mr. Yarby pounded his chest. Of course, my father said, like he knew it all along. Juicio for everyone. My father told my mother. She went into the kitchen to get it. While my father and Mrs. Yarby were discussing Juicio, Fudge disappeared. Stop and think about this book. Fudge has caused a lot of problems, and now he's disappeared. Do you think it's good or bad? Let's find out. Just as my mother served everyone a glass of Mr. Yarby's favorite drink, he came back. He was carrying a book, my old worn-out picture dictionary, the same one the Yarbys just gave me. See, Fudge said, climbing on Mrs. Yarby's lap. See, book. See, book. Now Fudge held it up over her head. I could use another one, I explained. I really can. That old one is falling apart. I tried to laugh. It's returnable, Mrs. Yarby said. It's silly to keep it if you already have one. She sounded insulted, like it was my fault she bought me something I already had. Mine, Fudge said. He closed the book and held it tight against his chest. Mine, mine, mine. It's the thought that counts, my mother said. It was so nice of you to think of our boys. Then she turned to Fudge. Put the book away now, Fudgy. Isn't it Fudgy's bedtime? My father hinted. Oh, yes, I think it is, my mother said, scooping him up. Say goodnight, Fudgy. Good night, Fudgy, my brother said, waving at us. Fudge was supposed to fall asleep before we sat down to dinner, but in case, my mother put a million little toys in his crib to keep him busy. I don't know who my mother thought she was fooling, because we all know that Fudge can climb out of his crib any old time he wants. He stayed away until we were in the middle of our roast beef. Then he came in carrying Dribble's bowl. He walked right up to Mrs. Yarby. He thought she was his new friend. "See," he said, holding Dribble under her nose. "See, Dribble?" Mrs. Yarby shrieked. "Oh, I can't stand reptiles. Get that thing away from me." Fudge looked disappointed. So he showed Dribble to Mr. Yarby. "See," he said. "Hatcher," Mr. Yarby boomed. "Make him get that thing out of here." I wondered why Mr. Yarby called my father Hatcher. Didn't he know my father's first name was Warren? And I didn't like the way Mr. and Mrs. Yarby both called Dribble a thing. I jumped up. "Give him to me," I told Fudge. I took Dribble and his bowl and marched into my room. I inspected my turtle all over. He seemed to be all right. I didn't want to make a big scene in front of our company, but I was mad. I mean, really mad. That kid knows he's not allowed to touch my turtle. "Peter," my father called, "come out and finish your dinner." When I got back to the table, I heard Mrs. Yarby say, "It must be interesting to have children. We never had any ourselves." "But if we did," Mr. Yarby told my father, "we'd teach them some good manners. I'm a firm believer in good old-fashioned manners." "So are we, Howard," my father said in a weak voice. I thought Mr. Yarby had a lot of nerve to hint that we had no manners. Didn't I pretend to like their dumb old picture dictionary? If that isn't good manners, then I don't know what is. My mother excused herself and carried Fudge back to my room. I guess she put him into his crib again. I hoped she told him to keep his hands off my things. We didn't hear from him again until dessert. Just as my mother was pouring the coffee, he ran in wearing my rubber gorilla mask from Halloween. It's a very real-looking mask. I guess that's why Mrs. Yarby screamed so loud. If she hadn't made so much noise, my mother probably wouldn't have spilled the coffee all over the floor. My father grabbed Fudge and pulled the gorilla mask off him. "That's not funny, Fudge," he said. "Funny," Fudge laughed. "Funny, funny, funny, Fudgy." "Yes, sir, Hatcher," Mr. Yarby said. "Old-fashioned manners." By that time, I'm sure my father was sorry the Yarbys weren't staying at a hotel. I finally got to bed at 10. Fudge was in his crib slurping away. I thought I'd never fall asleep, but I guess I did. I woke up once again when Fudge started babbling. He said, "Booba moomba boshi," whatever that means. I didn't even get scared. I whispered, "Shut up," and he did. Early the next morning, I felt something funny on my arm. At first, I didn't wake up. I just felt this little tickle. I thought it was part of my dream. But then I had a feeling somebody was staring at me. So I opened my eyes. Fudge was standing over me, and Dribble was crawling around on my arm. I guess Fudge could tell I was really about to kill him because he bent down and kissed me. That's what he does when my mother's angry at him. He thinks nobody can resist him when he makes himself so lovable. And a lot of times it works with my mother, but not with me. I jumped up, put Dribble back in his bowl, and I smacked Fudge on the back. Hard. He hollered. My father came running into my room. He was still in his pajamas. And he whispered, "What's going on in here?" I pointed at Fudge, and he pointed at me. My father picked up my brother and carried him off. "Go back to sleep, Peter," he said. "It's only 6 o'clock in the morning." I fell asleep for another hour, then woke up to an awful noise. It was Fudge playing his new train. It woke everybody, including the Yarbys. But this time, there was nobody they could blame. They were the ones that bought Fudge the train in the first place. Breakfast was a very quiet affair. Nobody had much to say. Mr. Yarby drank 2 glasses of Juicio. Then he told my father that he and Mrs. Yarby had their suitcases packed. They were leaving for a hotel as soon as breakfast was over. My father said he understood that the apartment was too small for so many people. My mother didn't say anything. When Mr. Yarby went into Fudge's bedroom to pick up his suitcase, his voice boomed, "Hatcher!" My father ran into the room. My mother and Mrs. Yarby followed him. I followed them. When we got there, we saw Fudge